Chapter 1. The man who preferred circuits. David Rogers trusted machines. Machines followed rules. If a motor failed, there was a reason. If a circuit overheated, there was a cause. If a design produced an unexpected result, enough testing would eventually reveal the answer. People, unfortunately, had never bothered reading the manual. David leaned back in his office chair and stared at the 3 monitors on his desk. One contained engineering schematics. Another displayed performance data. The third contained enough programming code to make most people question their career choices. To David, it was a pleasant Tuesday. A knock sounded on his open office door. "Working yourself to death again?" Without looking up, David said, "Statistically speaking, death remains unlikely." His cousin Emily walked inside. That's not a normal response. Neither was the question. It was completely normal. David finally looked at her and sighed. Emily immediately held up her left hand. There it was. The ring. Again. She had been married for 3 months. David had seen the ring approximately 6 million times. "Very shiny," he said. "I wasn't showing you the ring." "You absolutely were." "I wasn't. You adjusted your hand so the overhead light reflected off the diamond. That could happen naturally." "It could not." Emily laughed and dropped into the chair across from his desk. "You know most people would be happy I'm married." "I am happy you're married." "You don't sound happy. You've weaponized jewelry." "It's a wedding ring. It's a laser-guided wedding ring." Emily grinned. David shook his head and returned his attention to the monitor. His cousin watched him work for a few seconds. "You know, most 34-year-old men spend less time with computer models. Most 34-year-old men don't have this project. And most 34-year-old men occasionally go on dates." David immediately kept his eyes on the screen. Emily's grin widened. "Interesting. What is that reaction?" There wasn't a reaction. There was absolutely a reaction. It was blinking. "You got tense." "I'm sitting down." "David." "Emily." She folded her arms. He continued typing. A silent standoff developed. He knew she could maintain one indefinitely. The women in his family treated patience as a competitive sport. Finally, David sighed. "What do you want?" "I want to know why you've spent 12 years pretending women don't exist." "I don't pretend they don't exist." "You avoid them." "That's different." "Not really." David saved his work and turned toward her. The discussion was familiar. Unfortunately, his family rotated through it every few months. His sisters tried. His mother tried. His aunt tried. Now Emily had apparently drawn the short straw. "I don't avoid women." Emily simply stared. "Fine," David said. "I avoid dating." "Better. I just don't see the point." Because I have evidence." "Evidence?" "I dated exactly one person." Emily groaned. "Oh no." "What?" "You're doing the spreadsheet thing." "It isn't a spreadsheet. It is mentally." David couldn't help smiling. Possibly because she wasn't wrong. "I dated one woman," he said. "For 2.5 years. Emily leaned back. Neither spoke for a moment. She already knew the story. Everyone knew portions of it. The problem was that only David knew all of it. Or rather, knew none of it. Even now, 12 years later, he still couldn't explain what happened. He remembered every detail. The warm evening air. The restaurant terrace. The glass of red wine. The confused looks from strangers. Sandy standing abruptly. The anger on her face. The words, "I hate you." Then the wine. Then her leaving. No explanation. No warning. No closure. Just humiliation. After 2.5 years. The memory remained one of the few problems in his life that logic couldn't solve. Emily's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You know not every woman is Sandy." "I know. You don't sound convincing." "I know not every circuit board catches fire." "David. But when one does, I become cautious." Emily rubbed her forehead. "You compare everything to engineering." "Engineering has never thrown wine at me." She laughed despite herself. "Okay. That was funny." It was also accurate. A few seconds passed. Then Emily softened. "Seriously, you can't spend your whole life hiding from relationships." "I'm not hiding." "You're sheltering behind inventions." "I like inventions." "I know. And inventions make sense." "People make sense too." David raised an eyebrow. Emily immediately burst out laughing. "Okay, bad example." "Thank you." His office phone rang. The timing felt miraculous. David answered immediately. David Rogers. A familiar voice spoke. His uncle. The owner of the company. "Got good news." David smiled. His uncle only sounded that cheerful when something profitable happened. "Let's hear it." "The client approved phase 1. David straightened. Now that was important. The patent project represented years of work. Years. If all projections held, the manufacturing improvements would dramatically increase efficiency. Enough to secure the company's future for decades. Enough that David could finally step back. Not completely. He would always help. But for the first time, he could start thinking about his own future. "That's excellent," David said. "It gets better. Their consulting team arrives next week." Already. They want to move fast. David nodded. Fast was good. Fast meant progress. Fast meant results. Fast meant the hundreds of employees he cared about would remain secure. His uncle continued. I'll send over the information. Perfect. They exchanged a few more details before hanging up. Emily tilted her head. Project moving forward? Looks like it. Her eyes lit up. That's huge. It is. You might actually pull this off. David looked toward the schematics filling his screen. The design represented years of effort. Late nights, missed weekends, countless revisions. If everything worked, the company wouldn't need him anymore. At least not in the same way. His uncle would be secure. The employees would be secure. Emily could eventually take greater responsibility. Everyone would benefit. For the first time in years, an unfamiliar thought surfaced. What would he do afterward? The question lingered. He didn't have an answer. For so long, his responsibilities had defined his direction. Without them, the future felt strangely open, exciting, and slightly terrifying. Emily stood. Well, I should get back to work. Probably. She started toward the door. Then she stopped. One more thing. David immediately frowned. That tone never led anywhere good. What? If you ever decide to date again, please tell the woman you're not actually a robot. I'm not a robot. You have patents. Yes. You read engineering journals for fun. Yes. You once optimized a grocery list. It saved 23 minutes. Emily laughed all the way into the hallway. David watched her leave before returning his attention to the monitors. The office grew quiet again. Numbers, models, predictions, things he understood. Yet despite himself, his thoughts drifted. Future, freedom, possibility, and somewhere far in the past, a woman named Sandy Brown. For 12 years, David had been perfectly content never seeing her again. Unfortunately, life had never shown much respect for his plans. Chapter 2. An unexpected client. The following Monday began exactly the way David preferred. Quietly. No emergencies. No equipment failures. No meetings that should have been emails. The universe, naturally, considered this unacceptable. David was reviewing production projections when his office phone rang. David Rogers. Conference room in 10 minutes. His uncle's voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had already consumed too much coffee. The consultants? They just arrived. Early. I know. That's suspicious. His uncle laughed. See you in 10. The call ended. David saved his work and stood. As he crossed the factory floor, employees waved and greeted him. He returned the greetings with small nods. Most people assumed engineers noticed only machines. David noticed people, probably more than they realized. He knew whose daughter had started college, whose father was recovering from surgery, whose mortgage depended on next quarter's numbers looking healthy. Those things mattered to him. They were one of the reasons he had stayed. By the time he reached the conference room, several department managers had already gathered. His uncle stood near the front. Emily was beside him. The wedding ring sparkled beneath the lights. David pointed at it. You planned that. Emily grinned. You noticed. I'm beginning to think you carry a spotlight. Before she could reply, the conference room door opened. Several visitors entered. David glanced up casually, then froze. For one brief moment, he wondered if he'd accidentally stepped into a simulation. Because the woman walking through the doorway looked exactly like, no, it was Sandy Brown. 12 years vanished instantly. Not emotionally, not romantically, just visually. His brain recognized her immediately. The same expressive eyes, the same dark hair, the same quick confidence in her stride. She looked older now, of course. So did he. But there was no doubt. It was Sandy. The woman who had disappeared from his life while leaving him coated in Italian red wine. The consultant introductions continued. David heard almost none of them. Sandy hadn't seen him yet. She was reviewing a tablet while speaking quietly with a colleague. His heart was behaving strangely. Not racing, not panicking, more like restarting after years offline. Then Sandy looked up. Their eyes met. She stopped walking. For a fraction of a second, her expression emptied completely. Shock. Pure shock. David suspected his face looked similar. The room continued moving around them. People talking, chairs shifting, presentations preparing. Neither spoke. Neither looked away. Then Sandy's attention shifted slightly. Toward Emily. Toward the wedding ring. Toward the fact that Emily was standing beside David. Something flashed across Sandy's expression. Confusion. Then surprise. Then something else. Before David could identify it, she composed herself. Professionalism settled over her features. A carefully constructed wall. One he recognized. He built similar walls himself. His uncle remained blissfully unaware of the developing tension. Everyone. This is Sandy Brown from Harlow Consulting. David almost laughed. Of course it was Sandy. The universe apparently enjoyed dramatic reveals. Sandy extended a hand to various team members. Professional. Calm. Collected. Then eventually she reached David. For the first time in 12 years, they stood face to face. Up close again. The silence lasted half a second too long. Her hand remained extended. David. Her voice hadn't changed as much as he'd expected. Still warm, still clear, still capable of causing unexpected memories. Sandy. He shook her hand. Briefly, professionally. Neither smiled. Neither knew how. His uncle glanced between them. You two know each other? Dangerous question. David considered approximately 20 possible answers. Sandy beat him to it. We attended MIT together. Technically true. His uncle nodded. Small world. David mentally disagreed. The world appeared far too small. The meeting began. Charts appeared. Slides advanced. Consultants spoke. Managers asked questions. David contributed whenever necessary. Yet throughout the discussion he remained increasingly aware of Sandy's presence. Not because he wanted to be. More because his brain refused to ignore it. 12 years. No answers. No explanation. And now she was sitting 8 feet away discussing manufacturing analytics. Felt absurd. At one point, Sandy presented several efficiency recommendations. David listened carefully. Professional instinct overrode personal history. The recommendations were good. Actually very good. Detailed. Practical. Well-researched. When she finished, he spoke. The projected throughput increase assumes a 6-point reduction in calibration lag. Sandy nodded. Correct. Most consultants estimate 4. We measured your actual equipment performance. David studied the data. A moment later he nodded. Reasonable assumption. A small look of surprise crossed her face. Apparently she hadn't expected agreement. Honestly, neither had he. The discussion moved forward. The project consumed attention. Gradually the awkwardness diminished. Not disappeared. Never that. But work provided structure. Structure helped. 2 hours later the meeting adjourned. Managers filtered from the room. Consultants followed. David remained behind, gathering documents. He was nearly alone. Nearly. David. He looked up. Sandy stood near the conference table. For a moment neither spoke. Suddenly the room felt much quieter. Hello, she finally said. It was such a ridiculous opening that David almost smiled. Hello. Another silence followed. 12 years created a lot of silence. Sandy glanced away first. You look well. You too. Brilliant conversation. 2 educated adults operating at the level of awkward teenagers. Apparently some skills really were permanent. Sandy folded her arms, then immediately unfolded them. Nervous. Interesting. He'd never seen her nervous before. I wasn't expecting to see you here. Neither was I. She nodded. Another pause. Then her gaze drifted toward the hallway, specifically toward Emily, who was currently speaking with another consultant. The wedding ring caught the light again. David noticed Sandy looking, then noticed her expression. It took him exactly 3 seconds to realize what she was thinking. And he almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievably familiar. She thought Emily was his wife. Of course she did. From her perspective, that assumption made perfect sense. Unfortunately, David considered correcting her, then stopped. The conversation already felt fragile enough. Besides, her marital assumptions weren't really his responsibility. Sandy looked back toward him. You seem happy. The statement sounded oddly careful. I'm doing all right. She nodded slowly. And your wife seems nice. There it was. Direct confirmation. David fought the urge to rub his forehead. She's... Before he could finish, Sandy's phone rang. She checked the screen. A colleague. Sorry. No problem. I need to take this. David nodded. The moment vanished. Professional obligations won. Again. See you tomorrow, Sandy said. Tomorrow. She left. David remained standing in the conference room. Alone. Staring at the closed door. Then he shook his head. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. 12 years without seeing her. Less than 3 hours after reconnecting and she'd already mistaken his cousin for his wife. His life occasionally displayed a disturbing sense of humor. A few minutes later, he found Emily near the main office. She took one look at him, then narrowed her eyes. What happened? Nothing. That's not a nothing face. I have a nothing face. No, you don't. David sighed. Unfortunately, Emily knew him too well. The lead consultant is Sandy. Emily blinked. The Sandy. There's really only one. For once, his cousin looked speechless. Wow. Yes. That's awkward. Very. Emily thought for a moment. Then her eyes widened. Oh no. What? Did she see me? Yes. The ring. Yes. Emily covered her face. David instantly understood, because he had reached the exact same conclusion. Oh no. She repeated. Correct. She thinks I'm your wife. Correct. Emily started laughing. Hard. Far harder than the situation deserved. David stared at her. This isn't funny. It absolutely is. It isn't. It really is. She laughed harder. Several employees turned to look. David considered walking away. Eventually, Emily managed to regain control. Barely. Oh, this is amazing. Glad you're enjoying yourself. Are you going to tell her? I don't know. You should. Probably. Emily's grin returned. You know, this may be the funniest thing that's happened in years. David stared at the ceiling. The universe apparently wasn't finished with him yet, and something told him tomorrow was going to be considerably more complicated than today. Chapter 3. The Ghost of a Weinstein. David had faced production shortages, equipment failures, software corruption, investor audits, and one memorable incident involving a forklift and a loading dock that physics strongly advised against. None of those experiences prepared him for sitting across a conference table from Sandy Brown for 3 consecutive days. Work, however, proved surprisingly useful. It gave them something safe to discuss. Numbers, schedules, budgets, manufacturing forecasts, topics considerably less explosive than why she had publicly destroyed his last serious relationship and disappeared from his life. By Thursday morning, the project team had settled into a functional rhythm. The consultants occupied a temporary office near the engineering department. David spent most of his day moving between departments while helping implement recommendations. The project was progressing well. Very well, actually. Every forecast continued validating his original assumptions. If things remained on schedule, the patent implementation would transform the company's future. That thought alone put him in a better mood than usual, which was why he almost walked directly into Sandy while rounding a corner. Both stopped abruptly. "Pardon me," Sandy said. "You're forgiven." The words escaped before he thought about them. Sandy blinked. Then, despite herself, smiled. A real smile. The first one he'd seen from her since college. Unexpectedly, it looked familiar. Dangerously familiar. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sandy held up a folder. "I'm looking for Assembly 3. Wrong direction. Again. Again." She sighed dramatically. "I have a master's degree. Congratulations. I shouldn't be getting lost. You underestimate this building. That's fair." David pointed toward the far hallway. "You want the second right and then the blue double doors. The ones that look identical to the other blue doors?" "Exactly. Who designed this place?" "My uncle." "Ah." That reaction seemed judgmental. It absolutely was. He actually laughed. To his surprise, Sandy laughed too. The sound lingered for a second after the conversation ended. And suddenly things weren't quite so uncomfortable anymore. Not comfortable, just less awkward. A dangerous improvement. The walk toward Assembly 3 was quiet at first. Then Sandy glanced sideways. "Your team likes you." David frowned. "Based on what evidence?" "People smile when you walk by. They smile at everyone. They don't." David considered arguing, then decided she'd been observing longer than he realized. "They work hard," he said. "They deserve respect." "That's not what I meant." "What did you mean?" Sandy hesitated. "You know every employee's name." David shrugged. "I should. Most executives don't." "I'm not an executive." She gave him a look. "You have 6 patents. 7 if this project works." "Exactly. I still write code." "Normal people don't casually say things like that." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Normal people don't carry production analytics for recreational reading." Sandy looked down at the folder in her hand. "Fair point." They reached Assembly 3. Several workers greeted David immediately. One asked about a machine upgrade. Another asked about software modifications. A third wanted advice regarding college engineering programs for his son. David answered each question naturally, without thinking about it, without realizing Sandy was watching. Eventually, she excused herself to continue consulting work. As she walked away, she found herself strangely unsettled. Because David wasn't behaving the way she'd expected. Not even close. For years, she had built an image of him in her head. The man who betrayed her. The man who broke her trust. The man who somehow fooled her for over 2 years. Yet nothing she had witnessed all week matched that picture. If anything, he seemed exactly like the David she once knew. Responsible, patient, painfully honest. The kind of man who corrected his own mistakes before anyone else noticed them. It didn't make sense. And Sandy hated things that didn't make sense. Later that afternoon, Sandy found herself standing beside Emily during a project review. The two women had spent enough time together over the past few days to become friendly. Emily was easy to like. Warm, funny, confident, almost annoyingly happy. Married life clearly agreed with her. The wedding ring flashed again while Emily adjusted some documents. Sandy smiled. "How long have you been married?" Emily looked up. 3 months. Sandy nodded. "Congratulations." "Thank you." There was genuine affection in Emily's voice. Sandy recognized it immediately. The kind of happiness people couldn't fake. "You and your husband seem close." "We are." Emily smiled. "He's wonderful." "I'm glad." Sandy meant it. Whatever unpleasant history existed between herself and David had nothing to do with Emily. The conversation continued for another minute before something suddenly occurred to her. A simple curiosity. Nothing more. "How long have you known David?" Emily looked surprised. "All my life." Sandy paused. "Really?" "Yep." Emily seemed amused. We grew up together. Sandy frowned slightly. That was odd. Very odd. David had never mentioned a sister. Cousins? She asked. Emily blinked. Then an expression crossed her face so quickly Sandy nearly missed it. Realization. Complete realization. Followed by a heroic effort not to laugh. Oh! Emily covered her mouth. Oh no! Immediately, Sandy felt her stomach drop. Because there was only one reason for that reaction. Only one. Slowly, carefully, Sandy spoke. Why are you saying oh no? Emily failed miserably at maintaining composure. You thought. The rest disappeared beneath laughter. Sandy closed her eyes. No. Emily nodded. Yes. Oh my God. More laughter. Much more. Sandy wanted the floor to open beneath her. Instead, she was forced to stand there while understanding arrived with horrifying clarity. Wedding ring. Standing together. Family resemblance. Close relationship. Her assumptions. Every single one of them. Wrong. You aren't his wife. Emily nearly choked. No. You're his cousin. Yes. Sandy stared at the ceiling. Unfortunately, the ceiling offered no assistance. For several seconds, she simply stood there, motionless, trying to process how thoroughly she'd embarrassed herself. Again, it was becoming a pattern. When she finally looked back at Emily, she found her still smiling. You know what's really funny? I'm afraid to ask. David knew. Sandy froze. Knew what? That you thought I was his wife. Her face immediately turned red. He knew. Oh, absolutely. And he didn't correct me? Emily tilted her head. I think he was trying not to make things more awkward. Sandy groaned. That's somehow worse. It kind of is. Sandy laughed despite herself. What else could she do? The alternative was finding a large rock and living beneath it permanently. Emily's expression softened. You know, for what it's worth, he never got married either. The words landed harder than Sandy expected. She looked toward the conference room where David was currently reviewing diagrams. Still single. 12 years later. The knowledge created a strange feeling she couldn't immediately identify. Before she could think further, Emily spoke again. Can I ask something? Sandy hesitated. Sure. What actually happened? The question stopped her cold. After all these years, nobody had ever asked it quite that directly. Emily wasn't accusing, wasn't defending, just honestly curious. Sandy looked down at the floor. The short version? Emily nodded. Please. Sandy released a slow breath. A friend showed me a video. Emily's smile disappeared. A video? I thought David was cheating. Immediately, Emily's eyes widened. Then widened further. Then widened so much Sandy wondered if it hurt. Oh. Yeah. Oh. The single syllable contained volumes. Sandy suddenly didn't like where this conversation was heading. What? Emily looked genuinely horrified. Please tell me you asked him. Sandy swallowed. The answer spoke for itself. Emily closed her eyes. Oh no. And suddenly Sandy had a terrible suspicion. An absolutely terrible suspicion. The kind that made her stomach sink. The kind that arrived moments before disaster. Emily. Yeah. The woman in the video. Emily winced. That was enough. Sandy didn't even need the answer. She knew. And for the second time that day, the universe shifted beneath her feet. Because she was beginning to realize that the worst mistake of her life might have been even worse than she had imagined. Chapter 4. Fact-checking the past. Sandy Brown spent the remainder of the afternoon discovering entirely new levels of embarrassment. At 34 years old, she had considered herself a reasonably competent adult. Reasonably intelligent. Reasonably successful. Reasonably capable of evaluating situations correctly. Those beliefs were currently under aggressive attack. She sat in the temporary consulting office, staring at a spreadsheet she hadn't actually read in 10 minutes. Across the room, her colleague Mark looked up from his laptop. You okay? Depends on whether catastrophic humiliation causes permanent damage. Mark blinked. That's oddly specific. It feels specific. He wisely returned to his work. Sandy appreciated that. Because trying to explain what she'd just learned would require beginning with, 12 years ago, I publicly assaulted my boyfriend with Merlot because I thought his cousin was another woman. Even mentally, the sentence sounded terrible. Worse, the more she thought about it, the more obvious the mistake became. David had never been secretive. Never evasive. Never dishonest. 2.5 years together and she couldn't remember catching him in a lie. Not one. Yet she'd trusted a video over him. She had trusted a moment. An appearance. An assumption. The realization made her feel sick. Eventually she stood. She needed air. Or answers. Preferably both. David was alone in the engineering lab when Sandy found him. The large room contained prototype equipment, testing stations, computer systems, and enough exposed machinery to frighten an insurance company. David stood near a workbench reviewing sensor diagnostics. She paused in the doorway. For the first time in 12 years, she had absolutely no idea how to begin. David. He looked up, immediately noticing her expression. Something in his face softened slightly. Everything all right? No. Project issue? I wish. That earned a small frown. David set aside the tablet he had been studying. The room grew quiet. Sandy took a breath. Then another. No graceful approach existed. No professional wording. No elegant transition. So she simply stepped forward. The woman in the video was Emily. David didn't move. For several seconds, he simply looked at her. Then he slowly exhaled. Finally. After 12 years. Finally. Yes, he said quietly. The single word landed between them. Simple. Definite. A complete answer to a mystery that had haunted both of them. Sandy laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because she couldn't believe it. She was your cousin. Yes. You were never cheating. No. She closed her eyes briefly. God. The certainty in his voice somehow made everything worse. No anger. No defensiveness. Just truth. No. She repeated softly. David folded his arms. Not defensive. Just waiting. Patient as ever. It somehow made the conversation harder. I should have asked. Yes. She winced. Fair. Very fair. I saw the video. I figured. My friend was convinced. Apparently. I was convinced too. David nodded once. Neither sarcastic nor cruel. Simply acknowledging facts. Sandy took another step forward. Why didn't you tell me? For the first time, a flash of emotion crossed his face. Actual confusion. You left. The answer hit hard. Because it was true. Painfully true. She had left. Stormed out. Refused calls. Ignored messages. Changed apartments after graduation. Ended everything in the most dramatic way possible. She had never given him the opportunity. David looked away briefly, as if sorting through old memories. When the wine hit me, I honestly thought you were joking. Sandy wished he hadn't said that. Mostly because she could suddenly picture it. Perfectly. A younger David sitting at a restaurant table. Confused. Trying to understand. Still expecting an explanation. I wasn't joking. No. His voice remained calm. Too calm. That somehow hurt more than anger would have. I gathered that eventually. Silence followed. The kind that only arrives when old wounds finally receive proper attention. After a while, Sandy spoke again. I'm sorry. David didn't answer immediately. She couldn't blame him. Some apologies deserved consideration. 12 years certainly qualified. Finally, he sighed. You already said that. I know. Another pause. I don't think I understood just how wrong I was until today. That finally got a reaction. Faint smile. Small. Brief. But real. That's probably true. I deserve that too. You kind of do. Against all logic, they both laughed. The tension eased. Slightly. Not gone. But changed. Softer. Less sharp. Sandy looked around the lab. How long did it take you to figure out what happened? David considered the question. About 12 years. Her stomach dropped. You never knew? He shook his head. No. Not even a theory? Oh, lots of theories. She groaned. I'm afraid to ask. You should be. That made her laugh despite herself. David leaned against the workbench. At one point I considered whether I'd accidentally insulted your family. I would have remembered that. I know. What other theories? His expression became suspiciously thoughtful. Possibly food poisoning. Food poisoning? You stood up very suddenly. Sandy stared. That's your explanation? It was a working hypothesis. It was a terrible hypothesis. I eventually eliminated it. Good. Data was insufficient. She laughed again. There it was. The old David. The one she remembered. The one she had spent years convincing herself never existed. Steady. Dry humor. Ridiculously analytical. Comfortably himself. The realization hurt. Because she had lost all of it. For a misunderstanding. For a conversation she never had. Eventually the smiles faded. Reality returned. Sandy looked down at the floor. I really damaged something, didn't I? The question slipped out before she intended it to. David was quiet for a moment. Long enough that she almost wished she hadn't asked. Then he answered honestly. Just as he always had. Yeah. No anger. No accusation. Just truth. The single syllable carried 12 years of consequences. She nodded. Accepting it. What else could she do? I deserved that too. Probably. Another silence settled over them. This one gentler than the previous ones. Less painful. More reflective. Finally David spoke. You know what's weird? What? I never hated you. Sandy looked up. Genuinely surprised. You didn't. No. The answer came immediately. Certain. I was confused. He shrugged. Hurt. Embarrassed. Occasionally annoyed. Occasionally? Fine. Frequently annoyed. That's fair. But hate. He shook his head. No. For reasons she couldn't entirely explain, those words affected her more than anything else he'd said. Perhaps because she had spent 12 years assuming the opposite. Assuming she had become the villain in his story. Maybe she had. But apparently not completely. David glanced at a nearby monitor. Then back to her. Can I ask something? Of course. Why didn't you ever check? Sandy swallowed. The question she had dreaded. Because there was no good answer. Only an honest one. I was scared. David frowned slightly. Scared. I thought if I asked and it was true, I'd still lose you. The admission sounded pathetic aloud. Yet it was the truth. Youthful. Immature. Painfully human truth. So instead I guaranteed it. David looked at her for a long moment. Then surprisingly nodded. Not agreement. Understanding. I was 22 too. The words contained an unexpected generosity. Not absolution. Just perspective. They had both been young. Both imperfect. Both wrong in different ways. A notification sounded from David's tablet. Work intruded once again. The project waiting patiently in the background. Neither moved immediately. The conversation felt unfinished. Because it was. 12 years could not be repaired in a single afternoon. Still, something had changed. The mystery was gone. The truth was finally standing where the misunderstanding used to be. And the truth, while painful, felt infinitely lighter. As Sandy turned to leave, David spoke. Hey! She stopped. Yeah. His expression softened again. Just a little. For what it's worth. She waited. I'm glad I finally know. Sandy smiled sadly. So am I. Then she walked out of the lab. For the first time in 12 years, neither of them was carrying the wrong story anymore. Chapter 5. Apologies and patents. The following week should have been easier. The mystery was solved. The misunderstanding had finally been explained. The truth was out. Logically, everything should have settled down. Unfortunately, logic had entered the chat late and remained dramatically outnumbered. David discovered this Tuesday morning while standing beside Sandy reviewing implementation schedules. The conversation itself was perfectly normal. The problem was that now they knew. Every word carried 12 years of context. Every pause carried history. And somehow that was more distracting than confusion had been. Sandy pointed at a production timeline. If we move calibration testing forward 3 days, we'll shorten installation by almost a week. David studied the numbers. That'll create a bottleneck in assembly too. It shouldn't. It will. She crossed her arms. It shouldn't. David looked at her. She looked at him. Then both simultaneously turned toward the chart. 5 seconds later, Sandy sighed. It will. It will. I hate when you're right. No, you don't. That's true. David couldn't stop a small smile. Neither could she. The ease of it startled them both. Before either could comment on it, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the display. His uncle. That usually meant one of two things. Something had gone very right. Or very wrong. Excuse me. Sandy nodded. David stepped into the hallway. What's up? We've got a problem. Definitely the second category. What kind? Sensor array failure. David straightened immediately. Where? Prototype line. I'll be there in 2 minutes. The call ended. He didn't walk. He moved. Engineers possessed many superpowers. One of them was instantly identifying when a minor issue was secretly a major issue. By the time he reached the prototype facility, 3 technicians were already gathered around the equipment. His uncle stood nearby. Emily was there too. And, unfortunately, so was a very expensive machine that had decided to stop cooperating. David immediately began examining diagnostics. What happened? Error cascade, one technician said. After installation? About 20 minutes after startup. David nodded. A few moments later Sandy arrived. She stopped beside the group. Nobody questioned her presence anymore. At this point she knew the project almost as well as the core team. What can I do? She asked. David pointed toward a nearby terminal. Pull yesterday's performance logs. She was already moving. No hesitation. No discussion. Just action. Something about that made him oddly happy. The next hour disappeared into troubleshooting. Data flowed. Questions flew. Ideas bounced around the room. Slowly the cause emerged. Not a design problem. Not a patent issue. Not a manufacturing flaw. Just one supplier delivering components slightly outside specifications. Annoying. Expensive. Fixable. The best category of disaster. By lunchtime, the solution was already underway. His uncle released a long breath. Good work, everybody. The room relaxed. Even David. Which was exactly when Emily decided to become dangerous. So, she announced casually. Everyone immediately became concerned. Emily's so was legendary. It frequently preceded trouble. What? David asked. Nothing. Oh no. Sandy laughed. Emily pointed at her. See? She already knows. Knows what? Sandy asked. That you're impossible. David stared. His cousin appeared completely untroubled. You interrupted a perfectly good crisis for this? Actually, I waited until after the crisis. That's somehow worse. His uncle laughed. A technician snorted. Sandy looked suspiciously entertained. Traitor. Absolute traitor. Emily turned toward Sandy. Want to hear something funny? No, David said immediately. Yes, Sandy answered. Emily ignored him. For years, David thought there was a possibility his breakup involved food poisoning. The room exploded. Even his uncle doubled over. Sandy laughed so hard she had to lean against a workbench. David considered walking directly into traffic. That was one theory. A terrible theory, Sandy managed. I admitted that already. Food poisoning? One technician repeated. She stood up suddenly. That made everyone laugh harder. This is abuse, David announced. It's family, Emily corrected. Worse. Much worse. The laughter continued. And to David's surprise, he found himself smiling too. A genuine smile. Not forced. Not polite. The kind he hadn't used nearly enough lately. Sandy noticed. He knew she noticed because her laughter softened slightly. And for one strange second, the rest of the room disappeared. Not romantic. Not dramatic. Just familiar. Comfortable. Then someone changed the subject and reality resumed. Which was probably for the best. That evening David remained at the office longer than usual. Not because work required it. Because thinking required it. The prototype floor had grown quiet. Most employees had already gone home. He stood beside the large observation window overlooking the manufacturing line. Rows of equipment hummed steadily below. Years of effort. Years of planning. Years of responsibility. And somehow the finish line was finally visible. The realization felt strange. Good. But strange. A voice behind him interrupted his thoughts. Mind if I join you? Sandy. He nodded. A moment later she stood beside him. Together they looked out across the factory. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. Comfortable silences were dangerous things. Neither noticed how naturally this one arrived. It's impressive, Sandy said softly. What is? Everything. She gestured toward the production floor. You built a lot here. David shook his head. No. No. All of us did. That's not false modesty talking? He grimaced. I hate false modesty. I remember. If someone does something impressive, they're allowed to acknowledge it. Sandy smiled. That sounds like you. It's true. It is true. They stood quietly for a moment. Then Sandy spoke again. You could have left. David looked at her. What? MIT. She shrugged. You graduated at the top of your class. He didn't correct her. Mostly because it was true. You hold multiple patents. Still true. You could probably make ridiculous amounts of money. Definitely true. Why stay? David looked back toward the production floor. At the people still finishing shifts. At the machines he'd helped design. At the company his family had spent decades building. The answer came easily. Because it always had. Because money isn't the point. Sandy studied him. I used to love when you said things like that. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Silence followed. Sandy immediately looked away. Embarrassed. David, however, surprised himself by answering honestly. I meant them then too. Their eyes met. For a moment neither looked away. 12 years vanished. Not completely. Not enough. But a little. Enough to remember who they had once been. Enough to recognize something familiar beneath all the history. Sandy broke eye contact first. Probably wise. Because neither was ready for whatever conversation came after that. Instead she smiled softly. So what happens when the project succeeds? David leaned against the railing. The company becomes secure. And then, he hesitated. The question had been bothering him for weeks, maybe months. Then I figure out what I want. That's surprisingly vague. I know. You usually have 20-year plans. I know. Sandy laughed. What do you want to do? David considered. Really considered. I think. The words came slowly. I want to build something that's mine. She smiled. You should. Maybe. No. Her voice carried unusual certainty. You should. The confidence in her tone struck him unexpectedly hard. Not because of what she said. Because she believed it. Just like she used to. For the first time in years, someone was looking at him the way they had in college. Not as an employee. Not as an inventor. Not as a problem solver. Just David. The feeling was surprisingly difficult to ignore. The silence returned. Neither rushed to fill it. Outside, evening light painted long shadows across the factory floor. Inside, machines continued working steadily toward tomorrow. Finally Sandy glanced at her watch. I should go. Probably. She started walking away. Then paused. David. Yeah. For a moment she seemed uncertain. Then she smiled. A genuine one. Warm. Familiar. I'm glad we finally talked. David watched her for a second. Then nodded. So am I. Sandy left. The observation deck fell quiet again. David looked back over the factory. Over the future he had spent years building. For the first time, he found himself thinking about another future too. One that had absolutely nothing to do with patents. And that realization was significantly more intimidating. Chapter 6. Malfunctions, Weddings, and Meddling Relatives. If there was one thing David Rogers understood, it was systems. Well-designed systems were predictable. Inputs produced outputs. Cause created effect. Proper maintenance prevented failures. Families, unfortunately, ignored every engineering principle ever discovered. David realized this approximately 30 seconds after arriving at his parents' house for Sunday dinner. The attack began before he reached the table. "How's Sandy?" David stopped walking. His older sister Rachel looked entirely too pleased with herself. Across the room, his younger sister Melissa suddenly became interested in the conversation. His mother looked innocent, which was suspicious. His father quietly focused on the sports section of the newspaper. A man who had survived 37 years of marriage knew when not to get involved. David narrowed his eyes. "Who told you?" Rachel pointed toward the kitchen. Emily emerged carrying a bowl of salad. "Traitor," David said. Emily grinned. "I prefer informative family member." "You gave them information?" they asked. "You volunteered." "Also true." David looked around the room. Every woman present appeared interested. His father offered a tiny sympathetic nod from behind the newspaper. The universal signal for good luck, son. David sat down. Unfortunately, the interrogation continued. "So?" Melissa asked. "So what? Is she nice?" "You've met her." "And?" "You've met her." "David." He sighed. "Yes, she's nice." The women immediately exchanged looks. Dangerous looks. The kind women seemed able to communicate with at speeds beyond human comprehension. David had witnessed this phenomenon for 34 years and remained unable to decode it. "Stop that," he said. "Stop what?" his mother asked. "The telepathic conversation." "No idea what you're talking about." His father lowered the newspaper. "They're absolutely having a telepathic conversation." "Thank you." Then his father raised the newspaper again. His contribution complete. Dinner somehow became worse. Every topic returned to Sandy. Not directly, indirectly, which was far more effective. His family possessed expertise accumulated over generations. Eventually, Emily delivered the knockout blow. "She's coming to the wedding next Saturday." David looked up from his plate. "What wedding?" The entire table stared. Rachel blinked. "You forgot." "Apparently." Emily laughed. "My husband's cousin." David rubbed his forehead. "Right? You're coming." It wasn't a question. "Of course." Emily smiled sweetly. "Sandy is too." And there it was. The setup. The ambush. The premeditated family conspiracy. David pointed his fork at her. "You arranged that." "I absolutely did not." "You absolutely did." Emily smiled. His conviction strengthened. The woman was guilty. He couldn't prove it. But he knew. Like an engineer spotting a hidden defect. The evidence was circumstantial yet overwhelming. 3 days later, Sandy was laughing so hard she nearly spilled coffee onto project documentation. "You forgot the wedding?" David looked offended. "I remembered eventually. After being reminded." "Details." "No, that's the entire story." They were seated in a small conference room reviewing implementation schedules. Or at least theoretically reviewing implementation schedules. Actual productivity had collapsed several minutes earlier. For reasons David blamed entirely on her. Sandy smiled over the rim of her coffee cup. "I've never met anyone who remembers 6,000 lines of programming code but forgets family weddings." 6,000. Was that low? Significantly. She laughed again. The sound no longer surprised him. That was dangerous. 3 weeks ago it would have. Now it felt normal. Comfortable. Far too comfortable. A knock interrupted them. Emily entered carrying documents. And immediately noticed both smiling. The grin that appeared on her face should have required a permit. "Oh good." David closed his eyes. "What?" "Nothing." "Emily." "Nothing." Sandy looked between them. "You two realize you're related." "Unfortunately," David said. Emily ignored him. "Wedding seating assignments are finalized." David felt sudden concern. "I'm going to regret asking this." "Correct." Sandy laughed. Emily beamed. "You two are sitting together." The room became very quiet. Deliberately quiet. Suspiciously quiet. David stared. Sandy stared. Emily maintained complete innocence. A performance worthy of awards. "There's no way that's an accident," David said. "Of course it is." "It isn't." "It absolutely is." "You planned this." Emily pointed at Sandy. "See? This is why nobody believes engineers understand people." Then she left before either could respond. The door closed. Silence followed. Finally Sandy spoke. "She definitely planned it." "Thank you." "I've known her 3 weeks." "Thank you." "She absolutely planned it." David nodded. Vindicated at last. The wedding itself took place on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The venue overlooked a lake. White chairs lined a stone pathway. Flowers decorated nearly every visible surface. David arrived early. Against his better judgment. His family immediately found him. Against his better judgment. Then Sandy arrived. Against his increasingly weakening judgment. He noticed her before anyone else. That annoyed him. Sandy wore a simple blue dress. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to attract attention. Unfortunately, she succeeded anyway. She spotted him standing with his family. Then smiled. A small smile. Just for him. Something uncomfortable happened to his heartbeat. Emily appeared beside him. You should probably close your mouth. David immediately closed his mouth. Emily laughed. That obvious? I hate you. No, you don't. Unfortunately true. Sandy joined the group moments later. His family greeted her immediately, far too enthusiastically. Within minutes she was chatting with his mother, laughing with his sisters, and somehow discussing gardening with his aunt. David watched in disbelief. How is she doing that? His father appeared beside him. Doing what? Integrating. His father nodded thoughtfully. Women travel in packs. That explains nothing. Nothing explains women. David looked at him. His father looked at him. Then both turned toward the crowd. A rare father-son moment of complete agreement. The ceremony itself was beautiful, simple, warm, genuine, the kind that felt real rather than theatrical. Afterward came the reception. Food, music, conversation, dancing. David avoided the dancing with practiced efficiency. For almost 42 minutes. Then Sandy found him. There you are. I wasn't hiding. You absolutely were. There's no evidence. She pointed toward the corner table he'd occupied for half an hour. I have evidence. That's circumstantial. Sandy laughed, then held out a hand. No, that's not how this works. It is today. I don't dance. You do. Barely. Close enough. David looked around. Several family members were watching, waiting, anticipating. Emily might actually have binoculars. He couldn't be certain from this distance, but it seemed possible. I dislike all of them. I know. Sandy's smile softened. Come on. David looked at her hand, then at her, then took it. A mistake. Almost certainly. Yet he did it anyway. The dance floor wasn't crowded, which somehow made things worse. People could see. People definitely were seeing. His family certainly was. Sandy seemed entirely unbothered. You're nervous. I'm being evaluated. She laughed. No, you're not. He glanced toward his family. You're factually incorrect. Following his gaze, Sandy immediately spotted Emily grinning from across the room. Oh, exactly. They shared a laugh. Then the music slowed. Not dramatically, just enough. The conversation faded. For the first time all evening, neither had an easy joke ready. Sandy looked up at him. I've missed this. David's heart skipped. Actually skipped. An objectively annoying biological response. What? Talking to you. Her voice was quiet, honest. No games. No pressure. Just truth. The same truth he'd been carefully avoiding for weeks. Because he had missed it too. The conversations. The easy understanding. The feeling that someone actually saw him instead of what he produced. For a moment, the noise of the reception faded into the background. Just them. Just honesty. Dangerous territory. Very dangerous. David swallowed. Then answered. So have I. Across the room, Emily nearly fell out of her chair trying not to celebrate. Neither noticed. For once, their attention was entirely elsewhere. And for the first time since college, the future no longer felt quite so lonely. Chapter 7. New risks. The project succeeded on a Wednesday. Not dramatically. No fireworks. No speeches. No triumphant music playing from hidden speakers. Just data. Beautiful, undeniable data. David sat in the main conference room staring at the final performance report while the rest of the project team gathered around the table. His uncle read the numbers twice, then a third time, just to be certain. Finally, he lowered the report. Well, nobody spoke. Not because they didn't know what to say, because they knew exactly what it meant. The system had exceeded projections. Not matched. Exceeded. The manufacturing improvements were performing beyond the highest forecast model. Cost reductions, efficiency gains, future contracts, long-term stability, everything. Years of uncertainty had vanished into a stack of reports and verified performance metrics. His uncle slowly leaned back in his chair. We did it. This time the room erupted. Laughter, relief, celebration. People congratulated each other. Managers shook hands. Several employees who had worked thousands of hours on the project openly grinned. David watched it all quietly. The reaction was exactly why he stayed. Not the success itself. The people. The security. The knowledge that hundreds of families would continue having paychecks for years to come. His uncle moved around the table and stopped beside him. Thank you. David immediately looked uncomfortable. His uncle smiled knowingly. You always do that. Do what? Act like compliments are physical attacks. A few people nearby laughed. David considered a rebuttal. Found none. His uncle held out a folder. What is that? The transfer paperwork. David glanced down, then nodded. 8 months earlier he'd told almost no one about his plan. Now the paperwork made it official. Ownership rights, licensing structures, patent allocation. Everything necessary to transfer his newest patent almost entirely to the company. His uncle shook his head. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. No. Yes. The two stared at each other. A familiar family argument. Finally David smiled. The company needs it more than I do. His uncle looked emotional, which immediately alarmed David. Emotion frequently led to hugs. David disliked surprise hugs. Fortunately, his uncle settled for putting a hand on his shoulder. I'm proud of you. David looked away. There it was. The compliment problem. No winning response existed. If he accepted it normally, he felt arrogant. If he minimized it, he insulted the speaker. A terrible system. Thankfully, Emily rescued him. You broke him again. Everyone laughed. David appreciated her timing immensely. The celebration continued through the afternoon. Employees gathered in break rooms. Pizzas appeared. Someone located cake. Nobody was entirely sure where the cake came from. They accepted it anyway. By late afternoon, the factory felt unusually light. Hope did that. David stood near the edge of the production floor watching employees interact. The future was secure. Finally. Actually secure. Not projected. Not anticipated. Secure. Beside him, Sandy appeared carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. You look thoughtful. I am. Dangerous. Potentially. She smiled. You should be happy. I am. You don't look happy. David considered that. Fair observation. After a moment he nodded. I'm trying to figure something out. What? He looked around the factory. The question felt enormous, far larger than it should have. My next step. Sandy's expression softened immediately. Because she understood. Not the logistics. The feeling. For years his life had been moving toward this goal. A finish line. A responsibility. Now he had reached it. The problem was that nobody ever talked about what happened afterward. You've been preparing for this forever. Pretty much. And now. David laughed softly. And now I don't know. Sandy studied him. You know what's funny? What? The smartest person I know hates uncertainty. I don't hate uncertainty. She stared. He sighed. I strongly prefer alternatives. There it is. They both laughed. The sound came easy now. Too easy. The realization lingered. A comfortable thing neither wanted to examine too closely. Eventually Sandy spoke again. What do you actually want? David looked at her. Not the company. Not his family. Not obligations. Him. The question startled him. Because very few people asked it. Even fewer waited for an honest answer. After a long pause he spoke. I want to build my own company someday. The admission felt surprisingly vulnerable. Sandy merely smiled. I know. His eyebrows rose. You do. Of course. How? David. She laughed. You've been describing it without realizing it for weeks. Had he? Apparently. That was troubling. You should do it. There are risks. There are always risks. She waited. Then added quietly. Some things are worth them anyway. Their eyes met. Neither moved. Neither looked away. The conversation wasn't about business anymore. Both knew it. That made everything considerably more complicated. 3 days later, the consulting team's assignment officially concluded. The project was complete. Reports finalized. Recommendations implemented. Success achieved. Reality, however, arrived with a painful detail. The consultants were leaving. Sandy was leaving. David discovered this fact bothered him more than expected. Far more. He found himself staring at her nearly empty temporary office late Friday afternoon. Boxes sat beside the desk. Personal items packed away. Evidence of departure. Evidence of endings. Sandy noticed him standing in the doorway. You're looking at the boxes like they insulted your family. They're suspicious. She laughed. They're boxes. That's exactly what suspicious boxes would say. The smile lingered, then faded slightly. Neither spoke for a moment. The reality sat between them. Monday everything would be different. The project was over. No more daily meetings. No more casual conversations. No more excuses. Oddly enough, that thought made David feel worse than the idea of any business risk he'd ever faced. Sandy seemed to reach the same conclusion, because she set down the folder she was holding, then simply asked, what happens now? There it was. The question he'd been avoiding. Not about the company. Not about patents. Not about projects. Them. For once, engineering offered no useful framework. No model. No calculation. No guaranteed result. Only uncertainty. The thing he disliked most. David looked at her for a long moment, then laughed softly, almost at himself. What? Sandy asked. He shook his head. I spent years thinking logic would solve every important problem. And it turns out it doesn't. A smile touched her lips. No. No. Another heartbeat of silence. Then David did something that surprised even him. He took a risk. A real one. Not financial. Not professional. Personal. The terrifying kind. Sandy. Yeah. Would you have dinner with me? For one brief second she simply stared. Not because she hadn't heard. Because she'd been waiting for it. Hoping for it. Afraid of it. All at once. Then she smiled. The same smile he'd fallen for 12 years earlier. The same one he somehow never forgot. I'd like that. Relief hit him so hard it was almost ridiculous. Sandy laughed when she saw it. You were worried. I was not. You absolutely were. Possibly. Definitely. He shook his head. She smiled wider. And just like that, the uncertainty remained. The risk remained. The future remained unwritten. For the first time in a very long time, David found that maybe uncertainty wasn't the enemy. Maybe it was simply the price of something worth having. Chapter 8. The Leap. David Rogers had built a reputation for patience. He didn't rush decisions. He didn't chase trends. He didn't buy things simply because everyone else bought them. Every major choice in his life received careful thought, research, analysis, planning. So naturally, 48 hours before his first date with Sandy in 12 years, he found himself standing in his kitchen staring at a refrigerator. You've designed industrial automation systems, he muttered. The refrigerator remained unhelpful. You hold 7 patents. The refrigerator still refused to contribute. This is ridiculous. His refrigerator, maintaining its long history of emotional indifference, offered no opinion. The problem wasn't dinner. The restaurant was selected. The reservation was made. The logistics were simple. The problem was that this wasn't really a first date. Nor was it a continuation. It existed in a category all its own. A sequel delayed by 12 years. And David had absolutely no idea what the rules were. Meanwhile, Sandy was having similar problems. She sat in her apartment while her friend Lisa laughed mercilessly. You've got to be kidding. I'm serious. No, you're not. I am. Lisa pointed. You dated this man for 2.5 years. 12 years ago. You were practically engaged. We were not. You would have been. Sandy groaned. Unfortunately, Lisa wasn't entirely wrong. Before the restaurant disaster, she and David had absolutely discussed marriage. Not directly. Not formally. But they had talked about futures, shared apartments, career plans, dreams, the kinds of conversations people had when they imagined forever, which made the misunderstanding even more painful, because all of it had vanished in a single evening. You're nervous, Lisa said. Obviously. Good. Good. That means it matters. Sandy leaned back. That was the problem. It did matter. More than she wanted to admit. For weeks she had tried treating the situation carefully, logically, responsibly, but somewhere between solving project problems and dancing at Emily's wedding, her defenses had quietly disappeared. And now David mattered again. That was exciting. And terrifying. Mostly terrifying. Saturday evening arrived. The restaurant wasn't fancy. That had been deliberate. Neither wanted pressure. Neither wanted expectations. Just dinner. Just conversation. Just an opportunity to see where things went. David arrived first, 3 minutes early, which for him almost qualified as reckless spontaneity. When Sandy entered moments later, he stood. Their eyes met, and suddenly all the nervous preparation vanished. Not completely, just enough. Hi. Hi. The simplicity made them both smile. Promising start. Dinner began cautiously. Safe topics. Travel. Books. Family. The project. Eventually, however, the conversation deepened. Because neither had waited 12 years for small talk. You know something? Sandy asked. What? You changed. David considered. Hopefully. You did. Good change or bad change? Good. She smiled softly. You're happier. That surprised him. Happier? I think so. David thought about it. Then nodded. Maybe. What changed? The answer arrived before he could filter it. Perspective. Sandy waited. I spent years thinking one bad experience defined everything. Her expression softened. David shrugged. It was easier. Easier than what? Trying again. Neither looked away. The honesty felt strangely natural. Dangerous, but natural. I understand that, Sandy said quietly. I know. She smiled sadly. Do you? You haven't exactly been married either. That earned a laugh. Fair. For a few moments they ate in comfortable silence. Then Sandy set down her fork. Can I ask something? Of course. What scared you most? David raised an eyebrow. Regarding us. Straight to the point. Always one of her strengths. David considered lying. Then dismissed the idea. He'd had enough misunderstandings for one lifetime. Losing control. Sandy looked surprised. Control. I couldn't predict what happened. He leaned back slightly. The breakup. The confusion. Understanding slowly appeared in her eyes. You never got closure. No. And that terrified you. Yes. The answer came immediately. Because it was true. It was the only problem I couldn't solve. Sandy looked down briefly. When she looked back up, her expression was thoughtful. I think I was scared of being hurt. David smiled faintly. That part one knew. She laughed. Fair. Then her smile faded. I trusted fear more than I trusted you. The honesty in the statement hung between them. Raw. Difficult. Real. David reached across the table. Not dramatically. Not dramatically at all. Just enough to gently cover her hand with his. Sandy looked down. Then back up. That was a long time ago. Emotion flickered across her face. You really mean that? He thought about it. About 12 years. About anger. About confusion. About missed opportunities. Then he nodded. I do. For the first time that evening, her eyes looked suspiciously bright. Neither commented. Some moments deserved privacy, even when shared. After dinner they walked outside. The evening air was cool, comfortable. Streetlights painted soft pools of light across the sidewalk. Neither seemed eager to leave. Pleasant problem. They wandered slowly, talking, laughing, remembering, planning. For the first time, future conversations outnumbered past conversations. And that felt important. Eventually they stopped near a small park. The city around them had grown quiet. Sandy looked up at him. So, she smiled. You know this doesn't magically fix 12 years. No, we still have work to do. Definitely. We're probably going to make mistakes. Statistically inevitable. That earned a laugh. Then the laughter faded, leaving only honesty, the thing they'd both avoided years ago. I'd like to see where this goes, Sandy said. The words were simple. The meaning wasn't. David looked at her, at the woman he had loved, lost, found again, and somehow understood better now than he had at 22. For years he'd avoided risks he couldn't calculate. But every meaningful part of life seemed to require exactly that. Faith, trust, possibility, the things no spreadsheet could measure. He smiled. So would I. The smile she gave him in return felt brighter than any project success, any patent, any professional achievement. A different kind of victory, one he never expected to have another chance at. As they continued walking together into the night, David realized something. The greatest leap of his life had never been leaving MIT. It hadn't been accepting a lower salary to help his family. It hadn't been betting years on a patent that might fail. It was this, trusting someone again. And for once, he was glad there wasn't a formula for it. Because some of the best things in life couldn't be engineered. They simply had to be lived. Epilogue. A better investment 9 months later. David Rogers was standing in a half-finished workshop with a tape measure in one hand and a growing sense that he might be completely insane. Not because anything had gone wrong. Quite the opposite. Everything had gone almost suspiciously right. The family company was thriving. The patent implementation continued outperforming projections. New contracts had arrived. The employees were secure. His uncle was secure. Exactly as planned. The problem was that David was finally living the part of the plan that came afterward. And that still felt strange. A knock sounded against the open door. He looked up. Sandy stood outside holding 2 coffees. Please tell me you remembered to eat lunch. David accepted the coffee. I had a protein bar. That isn't lunch. It contains protein. It contains regret. David smiled. That had become a regular occurrence lately. Not because life had suddenly become perfect. It hadn't. Because Sandy made it difficult not to smile. She walked into the workshop and looked around. Workbenches, design tables, prototype equipment, half-installed computers, shelving units, boxes everywhere. The future. How's the startup coming? She asked. David looked around, then shrugged. Terrifyingly well. Good. It wasn't meant as a compliment. I know. She laughed. 9 months earlier they had decided to try again. Not erase the past. Not pretend it never happened. Just move forward. Carefully. Honestly. Together. And somehow, against every probability David would have assigned, it worked. The secret turned out to be remarkably simple. They talked. When something bothered them, they talked. When they disagreed, they talked. When assumptions tried to sneak into a conversation, they talked some more. It was astonishing how many problems could be solved by using words before launching beverages. David had mentioned that observation exactly once. Sandy had threatened to dump water on him. He had considered the threat entirely reasonable. She wandered over to one of the design boards. New sketches covered the surface. Product concepts, automation ideas, manufacturing solutions, dreams that had spent years waiting on responsibility. Now they finally had room to grow. You know, Sandy said, most people take vacations after finishing a major life goal. I know. You started another company. I know. You're impossible. Frequently. She smiled and leaned against the table. What are you thinking? David considered the question, then answered honestly. That I'm lucky. Sandy raised an eyebrow. That's not something I hear every day. I've been expanding my vocabulary. I'm proud of you. He rolled his eyes, but only slightly. The truth was, he had been thinking about luck lately. Not the random kind, the earned kind, the kind that came from second chances, from forgiveness, from putting faith in people despite previous evidence encouraging caution. His phone buzzed. He checked the message, then immediately sighed. What? Emily. Should I be worried? Always. Sandy laughed. What does she want? He handed over the phone. Picture filled the screen. Emily and her husband, both grinning, both holding something very small. Sandy's eyes widened. No way. Apparently, attached beneath the picture was a single message. You're going to be an uncle. Again. Better start practicing. David stared at the screen, then laughed. A genuine laugh. The kind that seemed to happen more often these days. Sandy handed the phone back. She's going to be unbearable. She already is. Good point. They stood quietly together. Outside, sunlight filtered through the workshop windows. Ahead lay new projects, new responsibilities, new opportunities. Not all of them predictable. Not all of them safe. David found he was finally comfortable with that. Because some things couldn't be forecast, couldn't be modeled, couldn't be guaranteed. Love, family, trust, hope. The best parts of life rarely came with instruction manuals. Sandy slipped her hand into his, naturally, effortlessly, as if it belonged there. David looked down at their joined hands and smiled. Years ago he had believed the smartest investment was a patent, or a company, or a carefully planned future. Now he knew better. The best investment he'd ever made wasn't something he invented. It was something he chose, a second chance. And this time he intended to keep it.